Chapter 6. Your friend isn't looking too happy. The ship's captain nudged Will with his elbow and gestured with a smirk at the figure huddled in the bow of the Sparrow, leaning against the bulwark, the cowl of his cloak drawn up over his head. It was a raw, overcast day, with the wind gusting at them out of the southeast, and a choppy, unpredictable swell surging in from the north. The wind blew the tops of the waves and hurled them back at the ship as it plunged into the troughs, smashing its bow down into the racing grey sea. "He'll be fine," Will said. But the shipmaster seemed to be uncommonly amused by the thought of someone suffering from seasickness. Perhaps, Will thought, it gave him a sense of superiority. "Never fails," the skipper continued cheerfully. "These strong, silent types on land always turn into green-faced crybabies once they feel a ship move an inch or two under their feet." In fact, the Sparrow was moving considerably more than that. She was plunging, lurching, and rolling against the opposing forces of wind and wave. "Are those rocks a problem?" Horace asked, pointing to where a line of rocks protruded from the sea as each line of rollers passed over them, seething with foam. They were several hundred meters away on the port side of the ship, and the wind was taking the ship down diagonally towards the rocks. The skipper regarded the line of rocks as they disappeared, then reappeared in time to the movement of the waves. "That's Palislade Reef," he told them. He squinted a little, measuring distances and angles in his mind, making sure the situation hadn't changed since the last time he'd checked, which had been only a few minutes previously. "We seem to be getting a little close to it," Horace said. "I've heard that's not a good idea." "We'll come close, but we'll weather it all right," the captain replied. "Land people like you always get a little edgy at the sight of Palisade Reef." "I'm not edgy," Horace told him. But the stiff tone of his voice belied his words. "I just wanted to make sure you know what you're doing." "Well now, my boy, that's why we've got oars out, you see. The sail is powering us, but the force of the wind is sending us down onto the reef. With the oars out, we're dragging her upwind enough so that we'll reach the backlift with plenty of room to spare." "The backlift?" Will asked. "What might that be?" "See how the reef line runs in the edge of the mull," the captain told him, pointing. Will nodded. He could see the line of troubled water that marked the reef. It did run into the foot of the large headland to the northwest, the Mull of Linkeith. "And see how the wind is coming from over my shoulder here and setting us down towards the reef itself." Again, Will nodded. "Well, the oars'll keep us far enough to the east to avoid the reef. Then, as we get closer to the mull, the wind will hit it and be deflected back at us. That's the backlift. In effect, it'll reverse, and we'll go about so it's actually blowing us clear of the reef. Then we've got a simple run for a few kilometers down the bay to the river mouth. We'll have to row that because the backlift will only last for a few hundred meters, enough to get us clear of the reef." "Interesting," Will said thoughtfully, studying the situation and assessing distances and angles for himself. Now that it had been pointed out, he could see that the Sparrow would pass clear of the end of the reef as they ran in under the mull. The captain might be lacking in sensitivity, but he seemed to know his business. "Maybe I should go forward and point out the reef to your friend," the captain said, grinning. "That should be good for a laugh. I'll wager he hasn't noticed it yet." He laughed at his own wit. "I'll look worried like this, shall I?" He assumed a mock-worried look, puckering his brows and pretending to chew his fingernails. Will regarded him coldly. "You could do that," he agreed. Then he added, "Tell me, is your first mate a good seaman?" "Well, of course he is. I wouldn't have him with me else," the captain replied. Why do you ask? We may need him to handle the ship when Halt throws you overboard, Will replied mildly. The captain started to laugh, then saw the look on Will's face, and stopped uncertainly. Holt becomes very bad-tempered when he's seasick, Will told him, particularly when people try to make sport of him. Especially when people try to make sport of him, Horace added. The captain suddenly didn't look so sure of himself. I was only joking. Will shook his head. So was that Scandian who laughed at him. He glanced at Horace. Remember what Halt did to him? Horace nodded seriously. It wasn't pretty. The captain looked from one to the other now. He'd had dealings with Scandians over the years. Most seafarers had, and he'd never met anyone who'd bested one. What did he do? Your friend, I mean, he asked. He puked into his helmet, Will said. Extensively, Horace added. The captain's jaw dropped as he tried to picture the scene. Will and Horace didn't bother to explain that Halt was wearing the borrowed helmet at the time, nor that he was under the protection of the massive Irak, future Obial of the Scandians. So the captain assumed that the smallish, grey-bearded man in the bows had ripped the helmet off a giant Scandian's head and thrown up into it, an action that would normally be tantamount to suicide. And the Scandian? What did he do? Will shrugged. He apologized. What else could he do? The captain looked from Will to Halt, and back to Will. The young man's face was serious, with no sign that he was gulling the captain. The captain swallowed several times, then decided that, even if he were being deceived, it might be more kindly to let Halt suffer his seasickness in peace. Sail! The cry came from the masthead lookout. Instinctively, all three of them looked up at him. He was pointing behind them, an arm outstretched to the southeast. Then they swung to follow that pointing arm. There was a low scud of sea mist further out to sea, but as they watched, a dark shape began to creep out of it, taking on firmer lines. Can you make her out? The captain yelled. The lookout shaded his eyes, peering more carefully at the following ship. 6 oars aside, and a square mainsail. She's coming up on us fast, head-reaching on us too. The strange ship was running before the wind and rowing strongly as well. Head-reaching meant she was able to aim for a point in advance of the Sparrow and reach it before them. There was no way they could avoid her. Can you make her out? The captain repeated. There was a moment's hesitation. I think she's the Claw, the Black O'Malley's ship, the lookout called. Will and Horace exchanged a worried glance. Then Halt was right, Will said. The morning after the confrontation with O'Malley in the tavern, Halt had roused his two companions early. Get dressed, he told them briefly. We're heading back to Fingal Bay. What about breakfast? Horace asked grumpily, knowing what the answer was going to be. We'll eat on the way. I hate it when we eat on the way, Horace grumbled. It does terrible things to my digestion. Nonetheless, he was an experienced campaigner. He dressed quickly, re-rolled his pack, and buckled on his sword. Will was ready a few seconds after him. Halt looked them over, checking that they had all their equipment. Let's go, he said, and led the way downstairs. He paid the innkeeper for their stay, and they made their way to the stables. The horses nickered a greeting as they entered. Halt, Will asked, once they were on the road, why Fingal Bay? We need a ship, Halt told him. Will glanced over his shoulder at the town they had just left. They were almost at the top of the hill, and the forest of masts was clearly visible. There are ships here, he pointed out, and Halt looked at him sidelong. There are, he agreed, and O'Malley is here as well. He already knows where we'll be going. I don't want him knowing when we go there." "You think he'd try to stop us, Halt?" Horace asked. The ranger nodded. "I'm sure he would. In fact, I'm sure he will. But if he doesn't know when we leave, it may mean we can give him the slip. Besides, the shipmasters in Fingal Bay are a little more honest than that nest of smugglers and thieves back there." "Only a little?" Will asked, hiding a grin. He knew Holt had a poor opinion of shipmasters in general, probably due to the fact that he hated travelling by sea. "No shipmaster is too honest," Holt replied dourly. At Fingal Bay, they'd contracted with the master of the Sparrow, a wide-beamed merchantman with enough space for them and their 3 horses. When the captain heard their destination, he frowned. "Crayskull River," he said. "A smuggler's den. Still, it's a good spot for landing. Probably why the smugglers use it so often. I'll want extra if we're going there." "Agreed," said Holt. He felt it reasonable to pay the man extra for the risk he was going to take, but not quite as much extra as the captain seemed to think it was worth. Eventually, they settled on a fee, and Holt counted it out. Then he added 3 more gold pieces to the pile on the table in front of them. The captain cocked an eye at it. "What's this?" Holt shoved the money towards him. "That's for keeping your mouth shut," he said. "I'd like to leave after dark, and I don't want people knowing where we're headed." The shipmaster shrugged. "My lips are sealed," he said. Then, turning away, he bellowed a string of curses and instructions at several crew members who were loading barrels into the ship's hold. Will grinned. "That's a lot of noise for sealed lips," he remarked. Now here they were, a few kilometers from their destination, and O'Malley had found them. His ship was faster and handier than theirs. It was designed to outrun King's vessels sent to intercept it, and it carried a larger crew than the Sparrow. Will could see their heads lining the bulwarks and see the occasional glint of weapons. At the raised stern, he could make out O'Malley himself, straining at the tiller and keeping the Claw on course. "We can't outrun them, can we?" Will started in surprise at Holt's voice, close behind him. He turned to see that the ranger had left his post in the bow and was now intent on the ship pursuing them. He was pale, but he seemed in control of himself now. Years ago, on the long trip to Hallisholm, Will remembered discussing seasickness with Svengel, Iraq's first mate. "You need something to take your mind off it," the burly Scandian had told him. "When you've got something else to focus on, you don't have time to be seasick." It seemed he had been right. Holt's attention was fixed on the smuggler's craft behind them. He seemed to have forgotten his uncertain stomach. The captain was shaking his head in answer to Holt's question. "No, we can't outrun them. He's faster than us, and he can point up higher into the wind than I can. He'll either drive us down onto the reef or—" He stopped, not liking the alternative. "Or what?" Horace asked. He loosened his sword in its scabbard. He'd seen the armed men aboard the Claw as well. "Or else he'll ram us. The prow of his ship is reinforced. Rumour is he's sunk more than one ship that way." He glared at Halt. "If you'd told me that O'Malley would come after you, I would never have taken you on board." The faintest hint of a smile touched Halt's pale face. "That's why I didn't tell you," he said. "So, what do you plan to do?" The captain shrugged helplessly. "What can I do? I can't outrun him, can't outfight him, can't even hand you over to him. He doesn't leave witnesses. We're just going to have to stand here and wait for him to sink us." Halt raised an eyebrow. "I think we can do a little better than that," he said. "Just let him get a little closer." The captain shrugged. I can't stop him getting a little closer. Then he added, What are you going to do with that? Halt was unslinging the longbow that was over his left shoulder. At the same time, he hitched the quiver on his right shoulder up a little and selected a shaft. Will, seeing the movement, unslung his own bow. 1 or 2 arrows won't stop that ship, the captain told him. Halt regarded him with some curiosity. I asked what you had in mind. Apparently, you're content to stand here while O'Malley rams us, sinks us, and leaves us to drown. The captain shifted uncomfortably. We might make it to shore, he said. I can throw over empty barrels and balks of timber to hang on to. We might be able to make it to the beach. More likely, we'll be washed into the reef itself, Halt said. But he wasn't looking at the captain. He'd stepped closer to the rail and had an arrow knocked to the string. His eyes were fixed on the figure at the Claw's tiller. O'Malley had his feet braced wide apart as he dragged on the wooden bar, heaving the ship's bow upwind against the thrust on the sail and the pull of the oars. The whole ship was in a delicate state of balance. Wind, oars, and tiller created a triangle of conflicting forces that resulted in the ship holding its present headway. Disturb one of those elements, Halt knew, and the result would be some moments of chaos as the remaining forces took charge. He gauged the distance and the movement of the ship under his feet. Strange, now that he was concentrating on the problem of making an accurate shot, the nausea caused by that movement had receded. He frowned. The claw was lifting and falling too. He'd have to factor that into the shot. He sensed Will beside him, his own bow ready. Good lad, he said. When I give you the word, we'll both shoot. I told you, the captain exclaimed. A couple of arrows won't stop that ship. We've little enough chance as it is. If you antagonize O'Malley, he'll make sure we're all dead before he leaves. The way I see it, Halt said, he won't be leaving. All right, Will, now! As if they were linked by some invisible force, the two rangers raised their bows, drew, sighted, and shot. The 2 arrows sailed away within half a second of each other.